The Fourth International in the Soviet Union by Leon Trotsky. This is from July 8, 1936. 1. The decision of the Seventh World Congress of the Comintern, according to which socialism in the Soviet Union has, quote, finally and irrevocably, end quote, triumphed, regardless of the low level of labor productivity, as compared with the advanced capitalist countries and independently of the course of development of all the rest of the world, is a crude and dangerous lie. The reference to the fact that the Soviet Union covers, quote, 1/6 of the Earth's surface, end quote, is all the less decisive in this question by virtue of the fact that only 8.5% of humanity has settled upon this area. It continues to be a question of the struggle between two irreconcilable systems, socialism and capitalism. This struggle has not been decided and cannot be decided within the boundaries of the USSR. It will be possible to decide the question, quote, finally and irrevocably, only on the world arena. 2. The principal mass of the means of production in the industry of the Soviet Union has grown tremendously and remains in the hands of the state, in agriculture in the hands of the kolkhoz, or collective farms, which stand between state and private property. But not even state property is as yet socialist property, for the latter has as its premise the dying away of the state as the guardian of property, the mitigation of inequality, and the gradual dissolution of the property concept even in the morals and customs of society. The real development in the Soviet Union in recent years has followed a directly opposite road. Inequality grows, and together with it state coercion. Given favorable domestic and international conditions, the transition is possible from the present state property to socialism. Given unfavorable conditions, however, a reversion to capitalism is also possible. 3. Every worker state in the first period will, in the interest of raising the productive forces, retain the system of work wages, or as Marx puts it, the, quote, bourgeois norm of distribution, end quote. The question is, however, decided by the general direction of the development. Were the advanced countries to be drawn into the revolution, and were social wealth to grow rapidly, then inequality would have to diminish speedily, and the state would soon have nothing more to, quote, guard. Given the isolation and the backwardness of the Soviet land, the bourgeois norms of distribution took on a crude and meretricious character. Enormous differentiation of work, wages, bonuses, titles, orders, and more of the same, and engendered retrograde tendencies that imperil the very system of state property. 4. Low productivity with a high capital investment, with tremendous military expenditures and the enormous wastefulness of the uncontrolled apparatus signifies the continuous salient lack of the most important objects of personal consumption for the masses of the population. The economic successes, which are much too modest for a significant material and cultural elevation of the whole people, are already proving adequate for the emergence of a broad privileged stratum. The social antagonisms have not been mitigated in the course of the second five-year plan, but are enormously accentuated. Inequality is growing by leaps and bounds. The hymns of praise to the, quote, happy life, end quote, are sung only by the summits, while the lower strata continue in enforced silence. 5. Playing upon the manifold social antagonisms, town and country, mental and physical labor, individual, farms, kolkhozes, and tiny private farms of the kolkhoz members, Stakhanovites and the rest of the working masses, the Soviet bureaucracy has acquired an actual independence from the toilers. Like every bureaucracy, the Soviet bureaucracy regulates the antagonisms in the interest of the stronger of the better off, of the privileged. Like every bureaucracy, it takes toward the end a significant portion of the national income for itself and thereby becomes the most privileged of all the privileged strata. 6. By its conditions of personal existence, Soviet society even now presents an enormous hierarchy, from vagabond children, prostitutes, slum proletarians, to the ruling, quote, 10,000, end quote, who lead the life of Western European magnates of capital. In contradiction to the contentions of the Seventh Congress of the Comintern, socialism has not yet triumphed, neither in the objective economic conditions of the USSR, the criterion of the productivity of labor, nor in the consciousness of the producing masses, the criterion of personal consumption. It remains a fact of decisive significance, however, that all the social relationships of the USSR, the privileges of the Soviet aristocracy included, based themselves in the long run on state and kolkhoz property, acquired by the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, which, in distinction from capitalist property, opens up the possibility of the growth of industry and of culture. The historical gulf dug by the October Revolution continues to separate the Soviet state-planned economy from capitalist, quote, statism, end quote, which signifies state intervention for the purpose of saving private property, and which, quote, regulates, end quote, the obsolete economic system by putting the brakes on the development of the productive forces and by lowering the standard of living of the people. The identification of the Soviet economy with the fascist Italy, Germany, which occurs so frequently among liberal economists, is a fruit of ignorance or of unscrupulousness. The victory of the Bonapartist bureaucracy of the USSR over the proletarian vanguard is by no means equivalent to the victory of the capitalist counter-revolution, although the former blazes the trail for the latter. 8. To assert, like the anarchists and all sorts of ultra-leftists, that the Soviet Union deserves on the part of the revolutionary proletariat the same attitude as do the imperialist states is to assert that it is a matter of indifference to the working class whether state industry and collectivized agriculture in the Soviet Union are to be preserved and further developed, or whether the economy is to be flung back into conditions of decomposition and by means of a civil war to fascist capitalism. Such an attitude is worthy of the disappointed idealistic, quote, friends, end quote, of the Soviet Union, that is, the dilettantes and political windbags of the liberal and anarchist type, but by no means of Marxian revolutionaries who never leave out of consideration the basic factor of history, the development of production. Nine. As has been said, the social stratification of Soviet society is developing mainly in the field of distribution and only partially, above all in agriculture, in the field of production. But distribution is not separated by an impenetrable wall from production. By deliberately stimulating the appetites of individuals and groups to the point where they become unbridled, the bureaucracy directly discredits the idea of social property. The growth of economic privileges engenders among the masses a justified doubt as to whom, in the long run, the whole system will actually serve. The, quote, bourgeois norms of distribution, end quote, which have already far exceeded the permissible limit, finally threaten to blow up the social discipline of the planned economy and therewith also state and kolkhoz property. It seems to me, just a side note for myself, it seems like Trotsky's misunderstanding what the bourgeois norms of distribution would be in like the first stage of like socialism, as Marx conceptualized, not the first stage, but communism, communism at the lower phase, bourgeois norms of distribution. Would facilitate a large degree of social equality, in the Marxist sense of from each according to their ability, from each according to their work. Unless Trotsky is accepting somehow that the work of the bureaucrat and the work of the technician and the engineer and so on and so forth is, quote, more productive than, say, someone on an assembly line, for instance. Or someone working on a collective farm is less productive and less deserving of remuneration than that of the engineer, or something like that, or the bureaucrat. These the bourgeois norms of distribution that Marx talks about in the Critique of the Gotha program are consist of a certain type of equality, although that equality is obviously problematic because people have different needs. Some people have bigger families. People have different this, that, and the other thing. So, one-to-one distribution of, or like a, same distribution according to work contradicts with human need, basically. Which is would be the distribution principle of communism. Yeah. Ten, the possible roads to the restoration of the bourgeois system are revealed with particular clarity in the question of the family. Since the bureaucracy is a consequence both of the low material and cultural level of the country and of the throttling of the initiative of the masses, has not succeeded in fulfilling the tasks of social maintenance and upbringing, it has begun to re-establish and glorify the petty bourgeois family, including its narrow private economy, that fostering soil of all species of social idiocy. But the family raises with particular sharpness the question of the right of inheritance. The bureaucracy itself, which endeavors to base itself politically upon the conservative family, feels the bureaucracy's own domination to be defective and incomplete. For the bureaucracy is not in a position to bequeath its material privilege to its successors. The question of the right of inheritance leads, however, to the question of the further extension of the bounds of private property. This is one of the possible channels of the restoration of capitalism. In all fields of social life, the bureaucracy imperils everything that is progressive in the Soviet system. Instead of the guardian of, quote, socialist property, end quote, the bureaucracy becomes socialist property's gravedigger. 11. The political significance of the new constitution of the USSR is in direct contradiction to its official interpretation. This is written in 1936, and to my understanding, the Soviet Constitution, which on paper was like one of the freest constitutions in the world, was published in 1936. I believe it could be, I'll just say mid-30s then. The quote Stalinist constitution, end quote, is no step forward, quote, from socialism to the communist society, end quote, as the official authorities brazenly assert, but it is on the contrary a step backward from the dictatorship of the proletariat to a bourgeois political regime. The development of socialist society should find the development of socialist society's expression in the political life in the dying away of the state. The degree of this dying away of the state is the surest measure of the success of socialist development. The beginning of the dying away of the state should be the complete liquidation of the bureaucracy lifting itself above society. In actual fact, however, the new constitution raises exactly the opposite process of development to a law. Nor can it be otherwise. The growth of privileges requires a gendarme for their supervision. (12) State coercion is not being attenuated according to the new constitution, but on the contrary is acquiring an exceptionally concentrated, open, and cynical character. The Soviets are destroyed. The local and central, that is, the quote municipal, end quote, and quote parliamentary, end quote, institutions built up on the basis of the plebiscitary system have nothing in common with the Soviets as the fighting organizations of the toiling masses. Besides, they have been deprived in advance of all genuine significance. The new constitution officially and publicly unites the power and control over all fields of economic and cultural life in the hands of the Stalinist, quote, party, end quote, which is independent both of the people and of its own members, and which represents a political machine of the ruling caste. 13. In passing, the Constitution liquidates de jure the ruling position of the proletariat in the state, a position which de facto has long been liquidated. Henceforth it is declared the dictatorship is, quote, classless and, quote, popular, which from the Marxian standpoint is pure nonsense. The dictatorship of the, quote, people over itself would have signified the dissolution of the state into society, that is, the death of the state. In reality, the new constitution seals the dictatorship of the privileged strata of Soviet society over the producing masses. thereby making the peaceful dying away of the state an impossibility, and opens up the bureaucracy, quote, legal, end quote, roads for the economic counter-revolution, that is, the restoration of capitalism by means of a, quote, cold stroke, a possibility for which the bureaucracy directly prepares by the bureaucracy's deception about the, quote, victory of socialism. It is our task to call upon the working class to oppose its own strength to the pressure of the bureaucracy for the defense of the great conquest of October. 14. In direct contradiction to the official line, the new Constitution not only does not extend Soviet, quote, democracy, end quote, but on the contrary confirms Soviet democracy's total strangulation. By every one of the Constitution's paragraphs, it proclaims that the present masters of the situation will not voluntarily relinquish their position to the people. The aristocratic and absolutist character of the new Constitution is most clearly expressed in the new crusade announced on the day of its publication. The crusade for the, quote, extermination of the enemies of the people, the Trotskyist vermin and furies, end quote. Pravda, June 5th, 1936. The bureaucracy is very clearly aware of whence comes the mortal danger that threatens it, and it directs the Bonapartist terror against the representatives of the proletarian vanguard. 15. The working class of the USSR has been robbed of the last possibility of a legal reformation of the state. The struggle against the bureaucracy necessarily becomes a revolutionary struggle. True to the traditions of Marxism, the Fourth International decisively rejects individual terror, as it does all other means of political adventurism. The bureaucracy can be smashed only by means of the goal-conscious movement of the masses against the usurpers, parasites, and oppressors. If a social counter-revolution, i.e. the overthrow of state ownership of the means of production and of the land, as well as the reestablishment of private property, is necessary for the return of the USSR to capitalism, then for the further development of socialism, a political revolution has become inevitable, i.e. the violent overthrow of the political rule of the degenerated bureaucracy while maintaining the property relations established by the October Revolution. The proletarian vanguard of the USSR, basing itself upon the toiling masses of the whole country and upon the revolutionary movement of the whole world, will have to batter down the bureaucracy by force, restore Soviet democracy, eliminate the enormous privileges, and assure a genuine advance to socialist equality. 16. On the question of war, as on all other questions, the parties of the Fourth International do not permit themselves to be guided by formalistic and idealistic considerations and sympathies, but only by Marxian criteria. If, for example, they support Ethiopia despite the slavery that still prevails in Ethiopia and despite the barbaric political regime, it is in the first place because an independent national state represents a progressive historical stage for a pre-capitalist country, and secondly, because the defeat of Italy would signify the beginning of the collapse of the obsolescent capitalist society. The proletarian vanguard of the entire world will support the USSR in war. In spite of the parasitic bureaucracy and the uncrowned negus in the Kremlin, because the social regime of the USSR, despite all its deformations and ulcers, represents an enormous historical step forward in comparison with putrefied capitalism. The defeat of an imperialist land in the new war will lead to the collapse not only of its state form, but also of its capitalist foundation, and consequently will also replace private property by state property. The defeat of the Soviet Union would not only signify the collapse of the Soviet bureaucracy, but also the replacement of state and collective property by capitalist chaos. The choice of political line under these conditions is inescapable. The resolute and intrepid support of the USSR by the world proletarian vanguard in a war does not, however, signify that the proletariat should become the ally of the imperialist allies of the USSR. Quote, The proletariat of a capitalist country that finds itself in an alliance with the USSR must retain fully and completely its irreconcilable hostility to the imperialist government of its own country. End quote. War in the Fourth International, Theses of the International Secretariat of the International Communist League, Bolshevik-Leninist, point 44. Quote, intransigent proletarian opposition to the imperialist ally must develop on the one hand on the basis of international class policy, on the other on the basis of the imperialist aims of the given government. The treacherous character of this, quote, alliance, its speculation on capitalist overturn in the USSR, etc. The policy of a proletarian party in an, quote, allied, as well as an enemy imperialist country should therefore be directed towards the revolutionary overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the seizure of power. Only in this way can a real alliance with the USSR be created and the first worker state be saved from disaster, end quote. I don't know where the start quote to that was, but... Oh, no, that was a whole quote. Sorry. 17. The fears of the, quote, ultra-leftist, end quote, that the victory of the USSR may lead to further consolidation of the position of the Bonapartist bureaucracy arise out of a false conception of international relationships as well as of the internal development of the USSR. The imperialists of all camps will not reconcile themselves with the Soviet Union until private property and the means of production has been reestablished. Whatever the grouping of states may be at the beginning of the war, the imperialists will, in the course of the war, know how to come to an understanding and to a regrouping among themselves, always at the expense of the USSR. The USSR will be able to emerge from a war without a defeat only under one condition, and that is if it is assisted by the revolution in the West or in the East. But the international revolution, the only way of saving the USSR, will at the same time signify the death blow for the Soviet bureaucracy. Shit. Folks been able to hear me this whole time? See how long I've been recording. I'll have to go back and look and see it because I had my sleeve on my phone. It's 22 minutes. Okay. Is the USSR a worker state? The USSR is a state which bases itself on the property relationships created by the proletarian revolution and which is administered by a labor bureaucracy in the interest of a new privileged strata. The Soviet Union can be called a worker state in approximately the same sense. Despite the vast difference in scale, in which a trade union led and betrayed by opportunists, that is, by agents of capital, can be called a workers' organization. Just as revolutionists defend every trade union, even the most thoroughly reformist from the class enemy, combating intransigently the treacherous leaders of the same at the same time, so the parties of the Fourth International defend the USSR against the blows of imperialism, without for a single moment giving up the struggle against the reactionary Stalinist apparatus. In war, as in peace, they guard their full freedom of criticism of the ruling Soviet caste and their full freedom of struggle against its agreements with the imperialist at the expense of the interests of the USSR and of the international revolution. All right, time to check if I screwed up that recording or not. At least not worse than how I usually screw them up, but thank you for listening.